Welcome to this presentation, Develop an Instructional Strategy. I'm David Lewis, and in this ongoing series we are discussing the steps in the Dick and Carey instructional design model. The purpose of this presentation is to provide a discussion of how to develop an instructional strategy. In particular, we're going to look at three components of an instructional strategy: sequence, Dick and Carey's learning components, and finally student groupings. Before we continue, let's look at where we are in the Dick and Carey instructional design model. Thus far, we have conducted a front-end analysis, including the needs assessment. We have developed performance objectives and assessments. Now it's time to develop an instructional strategy. Think of the instructional strategy as the plan. So we're really developing a design plan for our instructional materials. The Dick and Carey model makes a conscious effort to divide instructional design and development into two steps. But this is really difficult to do. They use this graphic organizer to show that sometimes the delivery system is already a foregone conclusion. So for instance, if you're a classroom instructor, you'll be delivering your instruction live. So you'll be the delivery system. However, there are other options. Your instruction could be televised, printed, or web-based instruction. Ideally, you would delay the delivery system decision until the end of the design process. But if you look at this graphic carefully, it has media and instructional development in the flowchart. That is, you first develop the plan by considering the content sequence, then organize your lessons by using the learning components and student groupings. Each of these ideas will be covered in detail in this presentation. In the next presentation, we will complete this graphic by discussing media selection and development. So let's begin by considering the sequence of instruction. There are really three levels of instructional design. The curriculum level is described as macro level design. Educators think of larger units of design when they're talking about curriculums. They usually are planning many months, if not years, of instruction at this level. So for instance, you might hear someone use the phrase high school curriculum. What they're describing is a multi-year plan, whereas a course is sometimes known as the meso or macro level, depending on the context. Instructional designers, more often than not, are really working at the course level though. That is, they concentrate on instruction that lasts months rather than years. And finally, we have micro-level design, which is the level of the lesson. In this presentation, we focus on course and lesson level design. You will likely see curriculum level design in other courses. However, some of the principles described here may be generalized to curriculum level. Let's begin our discussion of the sequence of instruction by looking at a course and considering the different levels in a typical course. Our own Dr. Simonson describes something he calls the unit module topic approach, or UMT model. Most distance learning courses follow this model. This is an approach for looking at how instruction may be developed at the course or macro level. Here, these blocks represent a course composed of 3 units. If you look at a unit, it's composed of modules, which I've color-coded here. And if you look at a module, they're composed of topics. In the Simonson's UMT model, each topic is one learning outcome. These topics are essentially the building blocks of a course. This is one very logical way of designing a course, and it allows you to see the structure or interrelationships of the topics at the module level and the modules at the unit level. This is one model of instruction at the macro or course level. but there are others. Another course design model is Rigeliff's elaboration theory of instruction. Rigeliff describes the course as being composed of an underlying structure or epitome which is referenced from time to time and then elaborated upon. Thus the name of his theory, the elaboration theory of instruction. Our course actually follows the elaboration theory of course design. The epitome or underlying structure in the course is the Dick and Carey model. If you think about it, the Dick and Carey book refers back to their model at the beginning of each chapter, and so does this course. This model is the epitome that this course is structured on, and this is the sequence of the lessons. The Dick and Carey model serves as an orientation structure that we refer to from time to time, and then elaborate upon the individual steps in the model. The orientation structure helps us to understand the whole design model by zooming in to look at the individual components of the model. This model is also a procedure, so it serves as a procedural structure. And we analyze each of these steps in order. If you look at the model as a whole, though, a lot of the detail is lost, and it's hard to understand it as a model. But if you zoom in to consider the components, you can understand each of the components in context. Now, there is such a thing as a supporting structure too. And each of our course presentations or book chapters serves as a supporting structure. If taken out of context, these don't make as much sense. But if each step in the model is followed in order, it all comes together in the end. Let's go back to our idea of building blocks to consider if a block is really the correct metaphor. Our building blocks represent the topics in a course. And if you really think about it though, the topics in a course vary in complexity and importance. So the topics in a course are really more like real blocks in that they all differ in size and complexity. And putting together instructional materials in a logical sequence or structure is the essence of the field of instructional design. As instructional designers or instructional technologists, we're often thought of as the engineers of instruction. Instructional designers use the term instructional sequence when they're thinking about materials in terms of time or the order of materials. On the other hand, we use the term structure to describe the complexity of the design of the materials themselves. So a better representation of instructional materials would be like this graphic, because topics are, well, quite different in complexity and size. So far, we have represented all the blocks as if they were the same size. This is because we were looking at course topics from the course level or macro level design. Macro level design is zoomed out at the course level, so it tends to forget about the finer details like those considered in course topics. When you start looking at the individual topics, though, that's micro level design. You may recall Gagné's design theory from another presentation. This is a micro-level strategy for considering the individual subunits or components of a lesson. Most of the work we've done in this class so far has been at the micro level. Gagné's instructional analysis is a method of designing instruction, and it's usually also used to sequence the instruction. Thus far, we've really only used this method to develop performance objectives and assessments. But if you think about it, it's a method of developing the sequence of instruction too. Each of these little blue boxes could just as easily represent the topics in a lesson. The instructional sequence for this goal statement then would be logically taught from left to right. And if subordinate skills are required for any of the major steps, then they need to be taught first prior to going on to the next major step in the goal statement. Now, depending on the complexity of each topic and the length of time required to teach these skills, we could also use this structure to sequence lessons in a larger course structure. This brings us now to how to teach these individual skills or topics. And we did discuss this somewhat in a previous presentation when we were discussing Gagne's domains of learning. But in order to sequence instruction, you must also consider how to represent these materials in a logical manner. And there's much in the way of instructional design theory to help us represent ideas or demonstrate skills. David Merrill worked with Gagne to extend Gagne's theories and develop something he called component design theory, or as it was originally described, component display theory. While this is really a topic for another presentation because it's quite an extensive discussion, it will be described here briefly. Component design theory is a micro-level design theory. That is, it's all about representing instructional materials at the lesson level. Merrill uses this theory to first categorize content as either facts, concepts, procedures, or principles. Once categorized, Merrill asks the question, if you have a fact or a concept, how is it that you present that to the learner? He developed something called the performance content matrix to help organize this theoretical framework. Each of these cells in this table represent a prescriptive presentation form for each type of content. Note there are three types of learner performances on the left here. Merrill's point is that the learner must be taught how to use concepts or procedures, for instance, and that this is best accomplished via a specific presentation form. In addition, as we've discussed, learners then must demonstrate what they have learned during a performance. But the thought here is, how do you present a procedure or principle to the learner? And according to this theory, each level of performance must have some presentation form associated with it that works well for that type of performance. Merrill built on the work of others to develop component design theory. In particular, he describes the work of Jerome Bruner, who distinguishes between expository or inquisitory presentation of instruction. This is what Merrill describes as a primary presentation form. We'll not get into it too much here, and much has been written about this type of instruction. Inquisitory learning, otherwise known as discovery learning, has gained quite a following over the past decade. But in many instances, this type of learning is less productive because it's unguided and can cause novice learners misconceptions and make them frustrated if they don't know how to do what is expected of them. This guided, unguided learning debate is really beyond this presentation, but will be taken up in another presentation. Suffice it to say that guided instruction and learning is better for novices, and unguided instruction is better for those with more expertise. When using discovery learning, it's suggested that learners be cognitively engaged in instruction, not just behaviorally engaged. Sequence and structure are perhaps the most interesting parts of instructional design, and I truly encourage you to go beyond your course readings to learn more about this aspect of instructional design. Also, other courses in our program delve into this in much more detail. But for now, Let's refer back to this graphic to consider the next step in our instructional strategy or plan, planning the learning components. This happens at the lesson level, and by definition that makes it a micro-level strategy. The learning components comes to us from Dick and Carey and is really based on Gagne's conditions of learning. Gagne describes these 9 conditions of learning in his 1965 book entitled The Conditions of Learning. If you recall, in 1965, most instruction was accomplished by classroom teachers, and this set of guidelines was originally developed as a set of procedures for administering class lessons. However, this list of lesson components is generalizable enough that it can be applied to any instructional lesson, be it a lesson in a web-based course or video. So these conditions of learning are not just for the classroom. Dick and Carey condensed Gagne's conditions of learning into a set of 5 learning components. Like Gagne's conditions of learning, these learning components are easily applicable to any type of instruction. In addition, a list of 5 learning components is far easier to remember than a list of 9 lesson components. So we'll discuss these individually as a series of lesson components that each instructional lesson should have. This is perhaps one of the most important parts of the Dick and Carey model, so take this seriously when designing instruction. The 5 learning components begins with pre-instructional activities. During this step in the lesson, one should motivate learners. Motivating learners allows a learner to focus their attention on the upcoming instructional materials. It's also important at this stage to provide a list of objectives. This gives them a preview of what's to come and will help them decide what to focus on and have as their study strategies. Finally, you should also consider describing prerequisite skills for a lesson. As we've discussed, prerequisite skills are the entry-level skills. Describing these skills allows a learner to relate what they already know to what is necessary for the current lesson. Next, we have content presentation. Content presentation means everything that is to be learned along with some relevant learning guidance. To get it, the learner must form a mental model of what is being presented. Learners need to be cognitively engaged during instruction. So guidance towards relevant features is the main goal of the instructor as they present materials. That is, they must prevent learners from being distracted by irrelevant features of a problem as it's being presented. And to truly understand what is being presented, learners must interact with the material in such a way that they can form an adequate mental model of the problem being solved. Once learners have a good mental model or schema, the next learning component is for learners to practice, but with instructor feedback. It's often helpful to allow learners to participate in an authentic learning environment. This is because contextual cues help them develop a rich understanding of the required performance. However, instructor guidance is required for participation to be truly effective. As Dick and Carey describe it, feedback is sometimes referred to as knowledge of results. Therefore, when learners accomplish the required task, they need to be told that they successfully completed the practice requirement. As we discussed in a previous presentation, criterion reference tests are the type of assessment suggested by the Dick and Carey model. That is, an assessment is based on some performance criteria. Instructional designers develop many types of assessments, but no matter what type of assessment is being performed, the learner performance must be acknowledged and graded. This is so they receive feedback, but also so you as the instructor can determine if the learner has actually performed to the required or recommended level. Finally, the fifth learning component is follow-through activities. The purpose of follow-through activities is to ensure that a learner's memory or transfer needs are addressed. As you're developing your instructional strategy or plan, you may want to group students so they can practice what they've learned as a group. The decision to group students is useful after content has been presented to allow them to participate. Grouping students can be helpful, but knowing when and when not to group students is an important skill for instructional designers. Instructional designers need to be cognizant of the advantages and disadvantages of student work groups. While group learning conditions can be very beneficial and teach learners to work together, it's a social activity, so some inequities can arise and actually be detrimental to learning. Researchers have identified these detrimental learning effects as the free rider or ganging up effects. Perhaps you've been a part of a group project and found that not everyone in the group has done their fair share. This in and of itself is an important lesson, but the issue is common and shows that while groups are useful in many circumstances, they're not always perfect. However, interacting with peers does have its advantages. Group work gives learners the opportunity to encounter ideas that are different from their own. This can often stimulate learners to clarify, reorganize, and reconceptualize what they've already learned. This is because collaboration gives learners the opportunity to observe others and get feedback. The best time to organize student groups is to do so as a follow-up activity once initial learning has taken place and all learners have a basic understanding of the lesson provided. While we're considering student groups, let's consider the types of interaction that can occur during instruction. First and foremost, one should always consider learner-content interaction. Certainly, content is very important and is the main reason the course exists. Learners come to you to learn and expect to be taught the material you provide. But there are other types of interaction. In addition, you should consider learner-learner interaction. Learner-learner interaction provides a sense of social presence within the course. Instructors should help guide these interactions to maintain a healthy social climate for learners. Next, you should also consider learner-instructor interaction. Your interactions with the students are important because you provide guidance. Learner-instructor interaction is related to something called instructional immediacy. Instructional immediacy is more a perception on the part of the learner and is basically the learner's overall perceived interactivity of you, the instructor. So as you design your instructional materials, understand that each of these types of interaction occur to some degree no matter what type of instruction is being developed. As we're all aware, we must be responsible for our own learning. But if the instruction is not well organized, it can cause problems too. One of these problems is something called isolation effects. Some students may feel isolated. This sense of isolation is due to less learner-instructor or even learner-learner interaction. Be aware that this is not simply a product of the online environment, though. All classes, even classroom-based courses, can suffer from these issues. But if you're aware of it, you can design learning environments that help learners feel they're a part of a course. Well, that brings us to the conclusions. This presentation has discussed developing an instructional strategy or plan. This graphic organizer, provided by the Dick and Carey book for developing the instructional plan, has been helpful. Just to review a bit, you often begin by asking what delivery system will be used. It's best to make that decision later in the process. So this presentation, postpone that decision and we'll discuss it in a later presentation. We did discuss sequencing instruction, both at the course level and the lesson level. You may recall that we discussed the unit module topic or UMT model of course design. In addition, we discussed elaboration theory as a course design model. Next, we discussed Dick and Carey's 5 learning components. They propose all lessons should contain pre-instructional activities, a content presentation, some learner participation, assessment, and follow-through activities. Finally, we also discussed learner groups and the advantages and disadvantages of learner groupings. In the next chapter and presentation, we will discuss media as a part of the instructional plan. It's then that we will think about the delivery system. Okay, well, until next time, goodbye.